Hey folks, I hope you're braced for a bit of goofiness since we're going to be poking into a niche title today, namely indie dev AkaBaka's Sucker for Love Date to Die For, a sequel to a series some of you may already be familiar with due to its predecessor First Date, a comedic horror visual novel that mixed in some neat bits of cultist activity to engage with. Alongside dating. That said, if you are a veteran, there's some pretty notable differences between the two iterations, given this time around there's a more active focus on survival-oriented gameplay. Which ultimately begs the question, was I enamored with these changes, or did they ultimately leave me heartbroken? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. And I gotta say, as far as dramatic homecomings go, finding yourself lured to your childhood town via mysterious invitation certainly ranks up there. Especially when said locale, the rural town of Sacramento, has been consumed by rumors of strange behavior by its inhabitants and whispers of mysterious disappearances. Still, Stardust, our protagonist, isn't easily dissuaded, which might be why she finds herself swept up in the machinations of a hostile cult in record time, and why she doesn't think twice about playing around with forces beyond her reckoning in her efforts to survive. Such as summoning an eldritch entity, Roxanne, a more literal and curvier take on our favorite black goat of the woods. Because what could go wrong when invoking a maddening entity associated with passion, fertility, and obsession? Don't answer that. Still, Stardust is a special case, in outlier as far as Roxanne's influence goes, which is a very fancy way of saying that she's immune to that influence due to being an asexual disaster. Not that it stops her from being appreciative of the Black Goat's company. That said, can she juggle interstellar romance while fending off the foreboding advances of the 1,000 Young cult? Well, hopefully, since we are here to flirt with curvy abominations from outer space and time. Just, don't expect the same narrative beats as its predecessor, First Date. For one thing, Date to Die For is a lot more focused, since there's only one Lovecraftian love interest that's central to the story. What's more, while it still takes plenty of time to crack wise with the comedy, it definitely puts a lot more emphasis on the horror elements this time around, and the act of building tension. That said, perhaps the biggest change of pace is how the story unfolds, since it's a bit less open-ended than First Date. See, while First Date's initial chapter is fairly straightforward to progress through, it becomes a much more open-ended experience during its second, with a lot of fun being centered in figuring out all the various permutations you could hunt down, and its final chapter taking a bit of secret hunting to unlock, which contributes to an overarching sense of discovery. Date to Die For, on the other hand, has its 4 chapters being a lot more focused, providing a default ending you can stumble into, as well as a true ending for each one, which entails a bit more lateral thinking, but is required to advance the game proper. That said, in practice, it's also a bit less grindy than you might expect, since the game provides a branching story tree complete with checkpoints, which also pinpoints what's needed to get to the other story route. It's pretty nice, all in all, though I do feel the need to make a small addendum here. While the checkpoint system works quite well for the majority of the game, Chapter 3 is sort of fiddly since the later checkpoints can soft lock you out of the good ending unless you start from near the beginning of the chapter. But we'll get to that in a bit. In the meantime, we have some gameplay to address, because, well, Date to Die For is a bit more involved on this front. See, the original Sucker for Love, the bulk of the gameplay could be summed up as light visual novelesque decision-making, albeit in an active form, being the occult rituals you engage in. You know, things like setting the mood with candles, laying out some nice offerings for your Eldritch companion, and following some easy guidelines like not looking at any windows or into any mirrors if you value your sanity. And to a certain degree, Date for Die For does follow a similar formula, given that it still has you engaging with those rituals in order to progress. But that's not the extent of things, because there's now new gameplay in the form of tense survival and exploration elements. See, in each chapter, the Cult of the 1,000 Young are rather actively seeking to snuff out Stardust, heavily complicating the process of finalizing the rituals she needs to progress through each chapter. Like, there is just something outright harrowing about creeping through this sprawling and otherwise empty home, only to partly slide a door open and then see the outline of a figure waiting nearby. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, really, because each ensuing chapter mixes things up by providing different types of obstacles. Chapter 2, for instance, has a more proactive stalker moving about the house, which requires a different strategy to overcome. You need to actively listen to see if they're close, which is nightmarish when you're greeted with the occasional bouts of silence and unsure if they're simply lingering or if they've drifted away. And Chapter 3, well, I actually have some mixed feelings on Chapter 3. As an experience goes, it's definitely unique compared to its predecessors, but it's not necessarily a good thing. Like, the setup for it is absolutely stellar, but in execution, it's more of a practice in trial and error that needs to be engaged with in a relatively linear fashion. And again, this is the chapter that gets a bit fiddly with the checkpoint system. That's not to say there wasn't some fun to figure out here, but it's definitely the weakest link out of the bunch. And that's also partly because Chapter 4 definitely isn't a slouch. Now, I won't say much about it, but it's definitely a bit more frantic than the rest of them and provides a distinct challenge that will feel very familiar if you've played the first game. But yeah, that's the gameplay, so let's mosey over to the more stylistic side of things. And on the whole, I do appreciate what Date to Die For has to offer on this front. The overall character designs and expressions during conversations adds a lot of life to the exchanges, and just makes things really fun. There's also a few freaky moments here and there, which made my morbid little ass happy. Really, my only regret here is that there aren't more Eldritch entities to encounter, because AkaBaka's take on them is a lot of fun. And speaking of fun, I am very appreciative of the audio side of things here. Like, right off the hop, the voice acting for the various characters makes this journey an absolute delight. The delivery on some of the lines actually got me laughing a few times, but it didn't stop there either, because when the game does decide to lean more towards being threatening or uncanny,
you worthless lamb.
Well, that's where all the ambient noises and music really kicks in. Skulking about the residence can be unnerving at the best of times, but Chapter 2 really did take the cake for me, if only because of how well it forced me to quiet down and listen for the impending sound of my death. And admittedly, for those who are hearing impaired, the game's subtitles are fairly good about delivering important audio cues, so a deaf player won't be completely stumped at these segments, though it is a bit harder to gauge distance that way. Still, that's the long of things, so let's sum it up. First off, as far as narratives go, I do enjoy it quite a bit. It's a neat, self-contained premise that offers a solid story to explore, and does a decent job of paying homage to its Lovecraftian source material while still maintaining its own identity. It has its own story to tell that doesn't necessarily just repackage a Lovecraft tale, and also fits within the broader scope of the Sucker for Love universe. It's just good. And I can definitely appreciate that, just like I can appreciate the fact that you can spray bottle Roxanne whenever she starts to get a bit too frisky. As for the gameplay, well, like I said before, I do think it brings a lot more to the table this time around as opposed to its predecessor, since there's not only rituals to fiddle around with, but the survival elements that are contingent on each chapter. It's a very neat touch that kept things feeling fresh for me for the entirety of the journey until the third chapter. Out of all of them, again, I have to emphasize that's the weakest of the bunch on a gameplay level, and I honestly feel like it was a letdown compared to what preceded it and what ensues. It's just a slog, really, since you'll be juggling a whole bunch of instant death triggers in the exact same order over and over again, instilling a sense of tedium rather than tension. Especially since you can botch the true ending for that chapter by playing the checkpoints, and then getting stuck in between instant kill triggers. It's not great, and it's sort of notable given there are only 4 chapters here. Also, while the 4th chapter is a lot more interesting, I'll admit that it did glitch for me a couple times, including one point where I became unable to be killed. So yeah, I like Date to Die For, quite a bit even, but I can't say it's a flawless experience. It has rough edges that do stick out a fair bit during the latter half of the experience, at least on the mechanical side of things. Still, given that I enjoyed the game, and I do think it warrants people giving it a gander despite its lower points, I ultimately can't help but qualify it as a hit, if only just barely, because while its lowest points may have been fumbled, the overall experience is one that's memorable, builds new and interesting mechanics on its predecessor, and leaves me hoping for more from the franchise and the developer as a whole. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment. If you've joined my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description. And check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel, like our good bean here, Andy noted. Also, I have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.